Hey everyone, welcome to the latest installment of MSP Business School. As always, I'm your host, Brian Doyle, and today we're going to be having one of those fireside chats I like to do every once in a while where we dig deep into a particular subject and really try to take a new approach to a task in the world of MSP as we come away from this session. So, today I'm taking one that's kind of near and dear to my heart, and that is the Technology Business Review. Obviously, many of you know that my day job is running VCIO Toolbox, and obviously, technology business reviews are a core component of that. And in working with my customers over the last year, I'm really seeing things starting to evolve and requiring a little bit different approach to those TBRs. You know, they can TBRs have been kind of cyclical over the last few years. They started off very information heavy, kind of in the beginning, a lot of KPIs, a lot of statistics. Customers really like them. It was great to see where they stood first meeting, and it was new information that they hadn't had. Second meeting, it validated that things were moving very strongly together. But by that third meeting, oftentimes that information was kind of looked at as great. I've seen this before. What's in it for me? What's different? So and then there was also realization from the MSP side of things. Hey, these are almost sales calls. We can really drive new revenue here. And unfortunately, the next phase of TBRs really became very salesy, right? It moved strictly to the account management teams. Quotas were even built around it, many of the VCIOs role. And as a result, they were forcing sales, and the customer saw right through that. So when you really look at how you got to approach things in a modern day, it's getting much more strategic, which has always been a tent pole here at VCIO Toolbox. That joint strategic plan is really meant to get the customer engaged with you, sharing information, and then you being able to leverage that information down the road, but in a constructive manner where they really feel like they're being guided on a journey that brings them to that eventual project, knowing fully what the business case behind it is, and being able to make that more informed, more confident decision about go or no go. But the issue that I've seen over the last couple of years is data continues to grow. We have more concerns around cybersecurity. Cyber liability insurance has become a key part of these QBR conversations. We're also starting to see that compliance is coming into play. Customers are looking a little bit more at risk. And when you start aggregating all that data, we're almost full circle back to that data overload position that we were in previously. So, how do we work through this data overload when these TBRs could have key performance indicators, strategic conversation, road mapping, asset management, risk management, cybersecurity progress, all these different discussion points, and boil it down in a way that you can share it with the customer, but also start ensuring that key stakeholders come back every meeting. And that's always been another problem that customers have faced with getting people into the technology business reviews. How do you get those key stakeholders in the meeting? How do you give people that have the right information? Well, maybe the key isn't always getting all the stakeholders at every meeting, but breaking down the meetings in a way that different stakeholders can attend and join in those meetings as you move through the cycle. So today we're really going to kick off with a few different things. We really see four different approaches potentially to building out your QBR or TBR schedule, and then throwing around it some customer feedback capability as well. So when we look at things, and I'm going to kind of speak today looking at quarterly being the way that we're breaking down these meetings. When you think about a quarterly cadence with your customer, there's really four ways you can go out and present. First one is QBR core, kind of the core, set the table for the year. Let's assume this is your Q1. Q1 TBR. Obviously, that might change if you're bringing a customer in mid-year, but that initial QBR you're doing with them is going to have some core data in it. Then when we move to quarter two, we'll really start looking at an approach where we talk about security and risk, and I'll go deeper into what should be included there in a few moments. Q3 can be health and assets. Now we're really looking at the infrastructure elements, asset management, asset governance. And then we get to a final year-end report, which really is going to sum up the year and set the table for the next year's cycle, which starts again with QBR core. So, what should be in each one of these core assessments or these TBRs. Well, starting with the QBR core, there's really 5 elements that you need to have. And every one of these meetings is going to start off with this first one. That's having an agenda. Now, the agenda is a very critical component when you think about setting up your meeting because it's how you set the tone with the customer. Without having a good agenda in place, meetings can often go into the abyss. I'm sure each and every one of you have been at a meeting where you've shown up with an agenda and it's gotten sidetracked by yesterday's problem, last week's ticket. And next thing you know, you're spending half your conversation on that discussion and not getting to your core agenda. No matter what type of meeting it is, we'll use the QBR still as kind of the focal point, but really that can happen anywhere you go. So I'm a big fan of putting together agendas, even sending those agendas to a customer in advance of the meeting, really making sure that they know what the expectation is both from your side and from their side, and giving them an opportunity to potentially contribute to that process as well. Then the second thing in the core is really building that joint strategic plan, or if you're in that second year of the cadence, reviewing where things stand in that joint strategic plan. Now, those of you that have worked with me or heard me before know I speak very heavily about building a joint strategic plan. In the modern day of the MSP, the service provider, where break fix is not as big an issue as it once was, where cloud services have been established and where cybersecurity is coming to the forefront, along with other emerging technologies like AI, we really need to get a strategic plan working with our customers, and it's never been more important. When you think about the customer, they're looking at technology a little bit differently, especially when we go back to that concept of AI. So what we've got to do is understand what they're trying to drive as a business. And we do that really by getting 4 key elements built out in this joint strategic plan. The first one is we always want to be a better partner to our customers. And to do that, we have to have a better understanding of what they're trying to accomplish beyond just the technology point of view. We want to understand the key initiatives they're going after as an organization and what the obstacles they feel are on the way to success. And when we can identify that, that really helps us understand what are they trying to accomplish. We can, term them business goals and business challenges, or however you want to view those. But really, it gives us an opportunity to see behind the curtain and see what matters to them. And oftentimes, technology will help in supporting those initiatives. It could be an automation play, an efficiency play. It could be a security play around that. And the other thing is oftentimes customers discount the technology that comes into solving those problems, kind of take it for granted, right? So this gives us an opportunity to kind of bring that to the forefront so they can see that technology relationship and help them when they're struggling with making buying decisions, feel a little bit more confident because they can see what the outcome is going to be and see where that contribution is going to be made by that technology project. The second core driver in building a strategic plan is simply you setting up the technology plan. It's always going to be your responsibility to bring the tech elements of that plan in, to bring the goals that are going to support the tech roadmap, and really make sure that the customer understands why they need to do these things. So, when we come into this area, it's also about protecting ourselves. We want to make sure that we're not viewed as a commodity. They know we're there to be in that leadership seat, whether it's being the CIO or in cases where we're in a co-managed situation, really making sure that the customer understands that we're there to be a trusted advisor with an outside perspective. So that us bringing that technology plan into the strategic, or technology goals into that strategic plan, is critical. The third thing is now really building some transparency into how the roadmap is built. When you have a strategic plan, you're basically building a check and balance system for the customer. You can now look at the client, show them where the technology meets the business need. And this really helps to bring some clarity and crystallize why they need to move forward with this project. This also guides them to making that more confident decision that they're in control of, less about us telling them what to do and more about them seeing what needs to be done. And it really changes the game when you start introducing those projects inside the roadmap for the customer as well. Finally, the last thing a good strategic plan can do for you is show progress. As you start closing up these projects, you're going to be able to show that those goals are being met, or at least that elements of what's supporting each goal is being met. And now the customer can measure the outcomes. So, again, when you really start thinking about building a more strategic relationship with the customer, getting better embedded into their organization, this is a perfect example of how that can get done. So, I really suggest that you look at building those strategic plans with your customers. And this is a core component of that QBR core. The next one is doing a scorecard, right? We always have to have that gap analysis in there, but we've got a lot of tools that are feeding data into into our systems, into our viewpoint that we can share out with our customers. So we really want to get all that information, create a scorecard for a customer, and help communicate where does their infrastructure sit, their cybersecurity sit, their Office 365 environment sit. And this is something that you can measure to and trend over time, but we want to introduce it here within the QBR core meeting. And then this is ultimately going to drive your scorecard. Drive your roadmap and your recommendations. And the roadmap is really a CFO view of the timeline of the entirety of all the projects. If you were just doing a 1 year plan with your customer, I think you're losing a lot of opportunity. By doing a multi-year plan with your customer, you're able to show them those big cost expenditures that are going to come down the road earlier in the process. You're going to be able to have those discussions earlier and make any adaptations or changes. Maybe you have to build a phased approach to a desktop refresh, as an example. And by showing this roadmap and building a multi-year, you're really helping the CFO see what are the big pictures, or what's the big picture story from an IT perspective, so they can manage the expenses across all departments. They may have $100,000 desktop refresh slated the same year they're looking to buy a new ERP system. And they might want to accelerate that desktop earlier, or maybe push it out a little bit later based on those expense loads. So, in capital requirements. So, again, think about the roadmap in that way. And then ultimately we use the roadmap to drive action, get the customers start closing out on those projects, start implementing those projects. And of course, that's where the reward comes back to you, the MSP. Now you're increasing revenue, you're bringing new projects into the game. So that's kind of the initial QBR. Now, when we go to QBR number 2, we're really going to focus on security and risk. And now we're going to bring some different elements. Some are consistent every meeting. We're going to bring that agenda in. We're going to continue to update that scorecard so we can show trending. But now we want to focus on other elements. We want to look at things like vulnerability. If you're doing continuous vulnerability scanning, this is a great meeting to come in there and show them what their vulnerability profile looks like, which are the risky assets on their networks, which are the ones that are falling behind, maybe not in Windows patching, maybe not in lifecycle, but application patching and things like that that can bring a vulnerability forth to the table. So this is a great time to really talk about the vulnerability story and really get into the customer about where some of their riskier assets, or maybe some of their riskier users might be within their environment. And when we talk about risky users, another thing you want to introduce here is kind of the results of security and awareness training. Many of you have implemented those tools into your customer, but I don't know if there's a lot of governance going on, really identifying who's taking those exams. Are they being completed? Who's clicking on those emails? Are they being educated? Have we really built a culture of cybersecurity within the client environment where people feel free to come when they make a mistake and share that with somebody internally? So we want to sit down and look at that security and awareness training reporting and really show the customer, hey, this is what your results are. And as you can see here, we have a few users who are repeatedly, or maybe not, but, let's go with the concept they are there, repeatedly clicking on phishing links, or, falling for some of or not taking their security training seriously, and see if we can start putting a governance layer to it and really guiding those customers to taking action and working with those people. Because the goal here is not really to reprimand them. I mean, certainly, if they're repeated users that just don't care, that's a different discussion. But for most people, it's just helping them, educate them to why this is important, and create that culture of cybersecurity awareness inside your environment. This is also a great time to talk about risk. I love risk management. When you look at risk management, it goes beyond what the scorecard often tells you, because now we're looking at those gaps we identify in the scorecard and we're putting priority to them. We're starting to measure impact and likelihood for those projects. And now we can communicate out to our customers which risks are the biggest ones that they're facing. And that risk plan shouldn't just stop with what we identify from our technical tools, but should also be looking at some of the macro conditions that the customer's facing as well. Are they going through a period of mergers and acquisitions? If they're going through something like that, that risk needs to be cataloged, because every time they inherit a new infrastructure, they may have done their due diligence to say, look, it's worthy of us taking on, but I'm sure there's significant improvements that might need to occur to meet your standards. If they're using open source software or building any custom software, you got to look at those individual components, the bill of materials for that custom software, and say to yourself, do we know if all these components are still being supported? If a component that they're utilizing becomes unsupported, there's a good chance that it could be exploited. Other things to consider are fire, flood, and earthquake considerations as well. If you are in one of those regions, you got to get that can hit one of those natural disasters quite regularly. You want to get that risk into your plan as well. So these are the things that we look at when we're building out a risk plan, and we need to communicate to a customer so they know which risks are the biggest and they can determine where they want to take action right away. It's also important to have this risk discussion with your customer from an MSP protection standpoint. If they say no to a project that's going to support that risk, you've got to get that documented as well, because that's going to become your CYA statement if something happens down the line. I've seen it repeatedly. You position a firewall with a customer, upgrade with a customer this year. They tell you, no, we're not going to do it. All of a sudden, a breach incident occurs, and now they're coming after you as the MSP, and they're saying to you, oh, you never pitched us that project. Now you want to have that in documentation. You want them to understand what the risks are, and you want to track the risks that they accept as well. And all of this can be done during that QBR event. If you're working with your customer on policy management, this is a great time to also make sure that new employees have signed off on their policies, that they've reviewed their policies within the last year, if they are, especially if they are kind of being held to a compliance standard. And this is also going to ensure things like this whole security conversation really is going to ensure that should something happen to a customer, they're not going to fall in the trap that 4 out of 10 clients do today, and that is not get their claim paid or at least paid in full as a result of something that was missing that they may have misrepresented, not intentionally, not falsely, but may have misrepresented the depth of on their on their insurance applications. So if you are doing some policy management, that kind of ties hand in hand with looking at the things that are going to help drive and support that cybersecurity culture and make sure that your cyber liability insurance, is really meeting the need for the organization. It's also a great time to make sure that to communicate those policies back out to your teams and make sure they really understand what they mean, because things do change quickly in technology. Finally, you go into roadmap and recommendations here. So, the consistent points across all all of these different QBR events are really scorecard and roadmap. So now we're heading into Q3, and in Q3 we really want to focus on health and assets. And when we get here, it's really looking at the asset story. Again, we got to, some of the things will, as I mentioned, we'll kind of cascade through it. We're still going to show our agenda. We're going to show our scorecard and our trend scorecard so the customer can see how we're doing. But now we really want to get into that deep dive asset conversation. We want them to understand their overall asset health. How many assets do they have that are expired under warranty? How many assets are currently vulnerable on their system based on the vulnerability scanning tool that you may utilize? And how many assets might be more than 5 years old? If we really look at an asset life cycle, 5 years is always considered to be the top end. Yes, we know some people are pushing the limit, trying to get more than that, especially on desktops. But we want to kind of at least let them know, hey, these are the machines that are starting to age out. And in that story, we also want to make sure that we're covering off on what might be important in that moment. Perfect example of that is right now we're having those Windows 10 conversations with our customers. Come October, Windows 10 will no longer be supported. And are all your assets up to Windows 11? So these are the kinds of things that we want to make sure that we're moving with our customer on and that we're representing during the asset health conversation. Then that will just go into roadmap and recommendations. So this tends to be a little bit more of a lightweight QBR. It's kind of showing the continual path across the process. We're getting health and assets in as the new subject to talk about, but it's also setting the table kind of for the next year as well. And this all gets summed up in your year-end report, which is really your fourth meeting. Here we do go into the greater detail, but we do it at a much more top-level format. The information that we want to bring forth to the customer includes bringing, of course, our agenda. We want to bring out our strategic plan and show what progress was made during the year. And this is really important because when you set up that strategic plan at the beginning of the year, you're not going to show a lot of initiatives that have been completed. But fast forward 4 quarters later, almost a year later, we should see a lot of those projects closing up. And I think it's good for the customer to see the progress that's been made throughout the year to understand where those service contract dollars have gone. We're going to share our scorecard again in our trending scorecard, hopefully showing improvement over month over month during that time. We're going to bring our risk plan in and just make sure that we all sit down and understand where we are within the risk plan and where those high risks still exist. And then we can potentially bring in some client feedback as well. Now, I'm going to go more right into feedback in a moment, but just think here, this would be the meeting that you'd want to bring that information into the QBR and really share with the customer what feedback you've gotten from their team during the year. And then we close everything out with kind of a roadmap and recommendation summary. So those are kind of the quarterly cadence, assuming you're doing quarterly with your customers. You'll notice that in each one of those phases, we're bringing a little bit different message to the client in the QBR. And then ultimately, we want to sum it up for them at the end of the year. So when we go into the new year, we can tackle things fresh and really restart the clock on everything. Now, I mentioned a little bit about feedback too. One of the things that we think is really important as part of the QBR process, but isn't part of the QBR itself, is periodic feedback, but really focusing on decision makers, influencers, and key stakeholders. So you want to put out alternating CSAT and Net Promoter Score surveys throughout the year. I usually suggest, a quarterly cadence for that as well. Send out a CSAT in Q1, in Q3, send out Net Promoter Score surveys in Q2 and Q4, and send out a project follow-up survey after any major project you do with your customer. And then when you get that data back, you can really share what customers, how feedback either improved during the year or what some of the feedback was that you got in that fourth quarter QBR, but really help reinforce the things that they were happy with and certainly the projects that were delivered and what the feedback was there as well. This is also a great mechanism to make sure you're not running into relationship risk. Now, the reason I say that is by no means are we suggesting getting rid of what you're doing at the transactional level. We believe very much that ticket surveys are great for getting in front of customer problems in real time and certainly better understanding how the end user community feels. The problem with them, though, is oftentimes our key executives, decision makers, and influencers are not represented there. They're not the ones returning those surveys. And as you all know, and we've talked about it many times here on our on MSP Business School, the biggest curse that an MSP has is the curse of the great MSP, which is simply the more we automate, the more we do remotely, the less we're on site and the less things break. And this is when our value gets called into question. Why are we paying so much? We don't see these guys anymore. We're basically on cruise control. So as a result of all that, we can often be at risk of our relationship, of them shopping us, thinking that we're a commodity and looking maybe to a lower cost provider. So we need to use these surveys that I'm speaking of to really stay in front of the stakeholders and measure, are we seeing the same responses back from the stakeholders that we're seeing downstream with the other teams? And if not, then it's something that we've got to go out and take action. Don't wait for the next QBR. Get a meeting, get a call, find out what's going on, dig into it, right? And make sure that the relationship doesn't turn sideways. So, guys, I hope that really, that gives you kind of a new approach for engaging your customers and bringing some fresh content to them in these QBRs. Again, to recite those 4 different QBRs. The first one is just a core QBR where we're setting the table for the year. We then go really deep in Q2 on security and risk. What are the things that they're facing from a security level? Q3 is when we go deeper on health and assets. And then Q4 is a year-end report. And across all those meetings, you're going to have standardized pieces like our scorecard, like our roadmap. So we're continually touching on progress throughout the year and not leaving out those core considerations that should be in every TBR. So if you have any questions on this, please feel free to reach out to me. You can reach out to me on LinkedIn. You can reach out to me directly at bdoyle@vciotoolbox.com. I always love to hear this information back and answer questions if anybody has one. And, as far as the podcast goes, you can get it anywhere you download your podcast as well as YouTube. So ring that bell, subscribe, and join us every week here. I want to thank you for joining me today on this Fireside Chat, and I look forward to seeing you again next week.